So we're talking about the base to final turn, which, for people who don't know, is this fourth and final turn, which pilots use to get the plane lined up with the runway before they can land. The base of the final turn, we're talking about it because it is it's one of the most dangerous parts about airplane flying, because it is when a plane is at its slowest and has the most possibility of possibly losing the ability to generate lift. The plane can have the possibility of losing the ability to generate lift, or you could control flight into terrain by not looking around to see what's around you. So what pilots have to do is, on the downwind, so when they're flying parallel to the runway, they have to pull the power and they want to deploy flaps so they can get to a slower airspeed. They want to use slower airspeeds because they don't want to have to use too long of a runway. So when they get to a good visual point where they know they can make the runway by turning, they will pull power and they'll deploy flaps. But what happens is, by pulling power and deploying those flaps, you begin slowing down the airplane. Then you have to bank into the base turn before even the final turn. So by banking into this base turn, the horizontal component of lift, which is causing the plane to turn, is detracting from the amount of lift being generated, which in turn is decreasing the airspeed of the airplane, and it could cause the airplane to start to slip down because the lifting factor is being taken away from, so it can make this horizontal factor of the turn. Now, that's just from downwind to base, but say you're at a very slow airspeed on base to final. At that slow airspeed, now, because of the configurations of your wings and how they're oriented towards the wind, you're not going to generate enough, you may not generate enough lift to sustain flight, and you may start to basically fall out of the sky. And in order to remedy that would be to pitch the nose down, wings level, and then try to level off as soon as you can so that we can build up airspeed so you can generate more lift. But at some airports, they have different terrain or obstacles that you could end up hitting if you get too low. So for the base to final turn, you want to slow down from normal traffic pattern airspeed limit is about 90 knots for non-turbine aircraft. Not an A-10. But for example, if this was a Cessna 172, it would be 90 knots. So you're trying to slow down from 90 knots, and you want to come in around, you want to land around 68 to 72 knots. But you don't want to get there until you're on final and you know you can land at the air. you can land. So you want to stay around 75 knots in base and the base to final turn. Now, some things you can do to mitigate the hazards or risks that come from slowing down the airplane on the base to final turn is by using verbal callouts. To verbalize to yourself and to remind yourself what's going on in the aircraft. So by calling out below 110 flaps 10, which is a common call out that most student pilots learn, is that student pilots know that they are below 110 knots and they're deploying flaps 10. Now this is because pilots don't want to overspeed their flaps, because that could end up causing problems for the flaps later on, or it could cause problems for the flaps in the moment. So you want to use safe speeds in order to use your flaps. By verbalizing you're using flaps 10, you're verbalizing to yourself, telling yourself what you're doing. And this is the most effective way to fly, is by verbalizing what you plan on doing next. Because if you only think, your thoughts come and go so quickly that you can only hold on to some of them, for so long that you forget. So by verbalizing them, you're telling yourself and you're telling your fellow passenger, whether they're an instructor or a student or just a passenger, that what you're doing. So another thing another thing you can do to avoid this base to final turn danger is setting a reminder for yourself in some way, shape, or form to add power back. Because when you're on the downwind leg, people will pull power so they can deploy their flaps, but they won't add power back, and that will cause them to start to descend fairly rapidly. So a good RPM to use when you're in the pattern on your base and final legs is about 18,000 RPM. Now, of course, on base and final, you're going to start to enter that region of reverse command where you're going to want to pitch for airspeed and power for altitude. So you'll have to play around with it a little bit so you get that nice gentle descent gradient down to the runway. Those are some tips to avoid getting too slow on final and in your base turn in the driving pattern.